8. Research, reasoning, and analysis. Advice on research usually covers physical issues such as finding books, conducting experiments, and searching computer databases. Such advice does not, however, address the key point that, since knowledge and reasoning are intimately connected, then searching for knowledge is a part of reasoning. The common thread between research and reasoning is that they both involve analysis, the thinking through of the connections between claims, or information. If we cannot consciously control our analysis, our thinking moves, then our research will fail to address the particular needs of the argument or explanation that we develop on the basis of what we discover. Furthermore, there is an easy way to conceptualize what we mean by analysis. It simply involves a constant process of asking questions. Questioning and testing possibilities are the most important thinking moves. 4 aspects of research, reasoning, and analysis will be discussed in this chapter. 1. We will look at knowledge in more detail. Reasoning depends absolutely on knowledge. Knowledge is the way that innumerable little pieces of information about the world are linked. Questions are a way of expressing and testing these links and, hence, are the crucial component of analysis. 2. We will then look at 4 perspectives on the process of finding information, what some might call doing research, as a reasoning process. We will look at information understood by where we find it. Information as it relates to other information. Information classified by the topic under investigation. 102. Research, reasoning, and analysis. 103. Information as it relates to how we are using it. 3. We will examine some general issues to do with sources. Sources can only be used effectively if we understand that the context in which the source was created is different from the context in which we are using the information from that source. If we do not recognize this change in context, we are not properly analyzing that information. 4. We will look at how questions can guide our search, and at how we can take information away from our sources, not just as information, but in a form that can easily be inserted into our arguments and explanations. Reasoning and analysis. Reasoning and knowledge. What any one individual knows about the world is extremely limited. People tend to be experts in certain small areas and ignorant in many others. Their detailed knowledge is often applicable only in limited situations. It could not be otherwise in modern society, considering the quantities of available information and consequent demands for specialization. You do not need to be a walking storehouse of information about everything, since there are many places to look if you need to fill in gaps in your knowledge. Moreover, there are many well-established research techniques to generate new data. In such circumstances, the truly knowledgeable people are those who are aware of what they do not know and who have skills in searching. These skills do not just involve knowing where and how to look for information. For example, the ability to search the internet for library holdings of a particular newspaper, technical skill in interviewing, the ability to perform an experiment. Much more importantly, searching skills involve an awareness of how the skills are related to the process of reasoning. We often think that finding things out precedes thinking about them. In fact, just as writing and speaking, the narrative flow, are bound up with reasoning, analytical structuring, the process of gathering the information also involves many of the important thinking moves that constitute our analysis. If we are unaware of these thinking moves, then much of our research will be ineffective or confusing. Reading, interviewing, experimenting, or any of the many research processes are not just about finding out information, they are necessarily processes of analysis. Reasoning is not the result of knowing things. Knowledge and reasoning are part and parcel of one another. Knowledge consists of both individual claims and the links between them, and hence must be expressed through arguments and explanations. We learn knowledge by understanding these arguments and explanations. Even the most specific statement of what we know, a single claim, requires 104 smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing a connection between more than one idea. What we know is best thought of as a network of interrelated claims, a series of potential, unexpressed arguments and explanations in our heads and in what we read and observe. Hence, knowledge is about relationships, our reasoning compared to, drawn from, contrasted fault with, and generally taken together with the reasoning of others. One of the best ways to understand how finding things out involves various analytical processes is to consider how questions, which can be used to guide our research, are, in fact, deeply implicated in reasoning. reasoned analysis as questions. It is usually thought that the key to scholarly, intellectual work is finding the answers. Well, it is not. Critical academic work about any topic is designed, first and foremost, to discover the right questions to ask. The answers come later, once those questions have been determined. While smart thinking is usually more pragmatic than the reflective work done by intellectuals, the same general rule applies in developing our analysis. Thinking first about questions is much smarter than trying to think first about answers. We can understand the significance of questions by thinking about their relationship to the basic process of reasoning, the linking of claims. For example, if I ask, does the historical racism of white Australia towards Asians still interfere with Australia's diplomatic relations with Malaysia? Then I am tentatively making the claim the historical racism of white Australia towards Asians still interferes with Australia's diplomatic relations with Malaysia. The answer to my question will, in effect, be a judgment of the acceptability or otherwise of this claim. The evidence that I gather and the arguments that I read and create in trying to answer the question become premises for my eventual conclusion, which either confirms or rejects that initial claim. A question, then, can be seen as a conclusion in prospect, a proposed relationship between ideas that needs to be tested. The question, what caused Australia to become less reliant on the United Kingdom in economic and political terms following the Second World War? Is different in that it presumes that Australia did become less reliant and that the answers will show how that occurred. So, questions are a way of unlocking and understanding the relationships between ideas. Although we might think of the answers that flow from them as being isolated, individual facts, claims, it is much more accurate to characterize the answers as relations between claims and, within a claim, between ideas and or events. To ask a question is always to call on some existing knowledge and to seek the connection between the answer and that existing knowledge. We want to develop these relationships so that they can form our claims, as well as the links between premises and from premises to conclusions, in our analytical structures. Every stage in the process of analyzing an issue can be thought of as one of questioning or interrogating. Questions provide the underlying glue that binds together the initial formulation of the topic or problem about which we are reasoning, and analysis. 105 Reasoning, our search for information about that topic, and the construction of an argument or explanation that leads to a conclusion. It is not the answers to these questions that matter, so much as the very fact that you ask them. Most students are worried about the right answer. People asked to perform a certain task at work also worry about getting the right outcome. There are few, if any, perfectly correct answers in the real world. Instead, there are processes we go through in order to come to a conclusion, an answer or outcome, that is going to be accepted as correct in relation to the context within which we operate. And that is why reasoning is so important. Reasoning is not about answers, the conclusions, but about the process of making answers more acceptable by giving appropriate reasons for them. Thinking through a series of questions is how we control this process. Hence, before and during the research process, we need to have questions in mind that are prompted by the particular topic or issue that we are investigating. We need, at the very least, to be using questions to formulate the precise dimensions of our topic, establishing the parameters of our analysis, what we do consider and what we do not consider. What broadly defined bodies of knowledge we will and will not call upon, what definitions of terms we will use within our reasoning, what methods of investigation we will use. In particular, we need to ask these questions to avoid assuming that there is one right topic in relation to a broad issue. Often the topics we are told to investigate or write about, whether through our work or study, are poorly formed or are deliberately open, thus requiring us to redefine them more carefully before we work on them. Each issue we encounter can give rise to a wide variety of topics. As we go about narrowing it down to the precise topic we are going to investigate, we must always be ready to justify our choices by thinking through the fundamental question of why have I chosen this particular topic, in this way, with references to these ideas and not some other topic. If we do, then we will be able to argue for and establish the acceptability of our decisions about topics. A precise topic enables us to search efficiently for information that will become our claims. It guides us regarding the sorts of reasoning we will need to use, reasoning from cause, analogy, and so on. A precise topic gives us a benchmark against which we can assess the relevance of any information we encounter, both in our research and in the final planning and construction of our arguments and explanations. A precise topic also provides the benchmark that enables us to judge the degree of evidence and argumentation needed to meet any requirements of the burden of proof, thus guiding our search further. But the key issue here is not the final product, the topic itself, but the insights we gain through the process of formulating it, and we must always be ready to change our topic in light of what we discover. We will encounter some more questions in Chapter 9. For the moment, let us turn to the ways in which we can think about the research process, not in terms of 106 smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing what we will find so much as the way that information and knowledge relates to the particular topic we are reasoning about. Information understood by where we find it. Let us begin with a little history lesson. 1J. C. R. Licklider was a leading U.S. scientist in the 1950s and 1960s. One of the founders of the Internet, and a visionary, he was lead author of a report in the 1960s on the future of the library, and libraries of the future. The report's main argument first of all recognized the value of the printed page. It was a superlative medium for information display and processing, small, light, movable, cuttable, clippable, pastable, replicable, disposable, and inexpensive. But, in an early sign of the impending crisis of information overload, the report outlines how the collecting of pages into books, journals, magazines, and bound documents, while necessary to allow even basic retrieval of information once printed, negated many or all of the display/processing features while only partially solving the huge difficulties of classifying, storing, and retrieving individual pages. It also created its own organizational problems. Licklider concluded if books, and we might include here all bound collections of pages, are intrinsically less than satisfactory for the storage, organization, retrieval, and display of information, then libraries of books are bound to be less satisfactory also. A device, he said, was needed to allow both the transport of information to the reader without transporting material and, at the same time, some processing of that information in ways that suited the reader's particular needs/uses of that information. A meld of library and computer is evidently required. While we might think we have that device, the Internet, we can probably see, even from the most cursory searching and browsing, that the Internet has solved many problems, but only at the cost of creating a lot of new problems. I use this example to make the point that the different categories of information sources you encounter, for example monographs, edited collections, journals, both print and electronic, newspapers, magazines, websites, email lists, reference books, conference proceedings, and so on, are primarily designed to assist in organizing information to make it readily available, rather than to assist you immediately to decide what to use for your reasoning. They make information accessible rather than making it analytical, sensible, or usable. That said, we should not ignore the way in which the places we look for information can, with careful use, provide some clues in the search for sense and utility. While these places might be distinguished by labels that tend to describe the form of their production, conference papers, monographs, these labels also imply certain judgments about the value and reliability of information one finds there. Here are some examples. Academic conferences are normally held to enable scholars and experts to present the latest findings of their research or applied work to their research, reasoning, and analysis 107 colleagues. Each paper that is presented is usually no more than an hour long, often shorter. Conferences tend to be organized around a topic, or defined subject. As a result, conference proceedings will tend to contain large numbers of highly specific papers that present detailed information on very tightly defined topics. The information is usually very recent. Journals are, in many cases, designed solely or predominantly for an academic audience, and the papers in them are refereed, that is, checked for quality by experts. Hundreds of journals are published. Like conferences, they are tightly themed. Media International Australia is a premier journal, usually focusing on Australian issues concerning the media, print and electronic. Articles tend to be longer, providing academics with greater scope to explain and explore their topic, but they also serve as part of an in-depth long-term conversation among scholars and experts in various intellectual disciplines. Popular magazines are intended to be read by people without much knowledge in a particular subject, but an interest. They are, predominantly, also governed by the need to attract and retain readership. The information is heavily processed to make it understandable. Simplicity, rather than complexity, is the aim. Brevity ensures continued attention. Examples and evidence are often sacrificed for the sake of a strong theme. Research is limited. What creates these different categories, then, is a mix of the mode of production, the intended audience and the manner of publication. We cannot, for example, make the above three distinctions without relying on the others. Journals appear as a distinct category precisely because there are other forms of publishing that are categorized differently. It is the relationship that matters. For analytical purposes, these clues provide only marginal assistance in making sense of the information, rich and complex, which we find in these sources. All they do is guide us, to some extent, as to the reliability of that information and perhaps the directness of the source. See direct and indirect sources later in this chapter. Thus, when we consider a key issue in reasoning, are our premises well founded? Chapter 5 we can see that this foundation is provided, very often, by the source of the information. Thus, deciding what exactly to find and how to find it may not be helped by these categories, but they are important in finalizing the strength and quality of argument. What we need at this stage are some other ways of thinking about how to find and use information. Exercise 8.1 Write down all the sources that you can think of, in no particular order. Perhaps start by listing the ones that you use most frequently. Then review the list and see if there are any you have missed. Remember, we are not talking here about specific titles, but types of sources. Thus, do not write the Australian, write newspapers. On the other hand, do not be too general. There is no point in writing books. You need to ask what kind. 108 Smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing information as it relates to other information. While each topic or subject on which we might conduct research will throw up its own specific relations between individual pieces of information, there are some broadly applicable general possibilities of relation that can assist you in reading critically, that is, reading in a way that makes it possible to argue and explain. We have already encountered the basis for these general possibilities in Chapter 7, when looking at the various ways in which we can reason. Using as my board example here, the impact of the Internet on Australian society, I will give some examples of how thinking about the relationship of information to additional information might guide our search for more material. Relations of specific and general. We might read in an article about two successful e-commerce ventures in Australia, call them x.com.au and y.com.au. Immediately we need to think, are these two specific examples unusual, representative, evidence of a trend? We are seeing if there is a relationship between the specific claim X and Y are successful e-commerce businesses and a more general claim that there are many successful e-commerce businesses in Australia. We need to read additional articles/books to find out if there are many more examples or not. To reverse the example, we might read that, while more men use the Internet in Australia than women, those women who are online spend more time communicating and less time surfing the web. We are trying to determine what kind of computer training needs to be given to a group of elderly women at a nursing home who are all keen to get online. Can we relate that general information to the specific case we are investigating? Or, perhaps, we need more detailed information on what older women do, not just women. Again, we go to a source looking specifically for this material, based on the tentative information relationship we have identified. Relations of similarity and difference. We might, for example, discover that there has been a 100% increase in Internet use in Australia in the past 2 years. We can immediately begin to think about the following: was this increase the same, or more or less in previous years? Have there been similar rises in other countries recently? Again, in a more complex example, we read that Australia was one of the countries that most quickly, in terms of time and number of users, adopted video recorders and mobile phones when they were introduced. There is a relationship there. Both the Internet and VCRs/phones are information/communication technologies. Can we draw some lessons from a comparison? Are they similar enough? Too different? A final example, we read that the Internet cannot be easily censored. We then read another article that outlines the reasons why it can be censored effectively. The research, reasoning, and analysis 109 relationship here is one of difference, two conclusions that are contradictory. We need to ask, How can these two positions be resolved, if at all? Why do the authors have different perspectives on a similar theme? Relations of cause and effect. We hear from friends that many new members of a virtual community to which they belong report initially high levels of enthusiasm, followed by a rapid decline in interest and a return to the activities that previously they pursued. We have also read, in a book on virtual communities, that this effect can be seen in many online communities. We also read, in yet another book on communities in general, that it is not the physical area nor the communication between members that makes a community but the shared activities which members undertake without realizing they are in a community. A link seems to suggest itself. We need to look for information on the possibility that what causes the failure of virtual communities is, in some cases, the fact that the only commonality of members is the time they spend online doing the community, rather than actually being it. These are, in simplified form, examples of the way we need to make information analytical if we are to use it effectively. Information classified by the topic under investigation as well as looking for information prompted by how it relates to other information. We can also consider that there are, broadly, 5 classes of information involved in reasoning. 2 Each is defined in relation to the particular topic we are investigating, and to each other. These classes can be understood as an answer to the question, how does this information relate to the information involved in my specific topic of investigation? They are, 1. Information directly relating to the specific topic we are investigating. 2. Information about the specific background to this topic, closely related knowledge. 3. Information about other topics, different from the specific focus of our investigation, but that provides insights that are relevant or analogous to our topic. 4. Information about the broad field of topics into which this particular topic fits. 5. Information of theoretical perspectives that are used to establish the topic as a topic and to set the parameters of investigation. Each class denotes a different relationship between information, focused around the topic. For example, what allows us to talk about a related topics class is the relationship between that class and the specific topic we are reading about. 2. Even 110 Smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing. Think in these terms is to be implicitly analyzing the world. Let us consider an extended example of the analysis that lies behind this classification. Imagine we are investigating the way in which nationalism is used in Australian television advertising. Think, for example, of the Qantas television commercials with the "I Still Call Australia Home" theme or Telstra advertisements that emphasize we are Australian. Here are some examples of what we might find when we are guided by the 5 classes above. 3. First, we need to gather material on a specific topic itself. While we might well find material written in advertising magazines, such as Ad News, we would first watch numerous television commercials that use images of Australia. We could interview other viewers, we could talk to advertising agencies. We could compare nationalistic and other advertisements. This class of knowledge is what is usually established by the regular research activities of various scholars and investigators. So, in our own investigation, it is the principal category of knowledge that we are creating. Second, we should turn to material on the specific background, which is usually found in the writings of other researchers. For example, Paul James's article, Australia in the Corporate Image, A New Nationalism '4 discusses in detail the use of Australian nationalism in marketing campaigns in the 1970s. Third, we need to know about other specific topics with relevant insights. Ruth Abbey and Joe Crawford's Crocodile Dundee or Davy Crockett ?5 does not tell us anything about television advertising. But, in its discussion of the nationalist elements of the film Crocodile Dundee, we can find some relevant insights. Fourth, we need to understand the broad background of the topic, which would involve developing our knowledge of advertising and nationalism. Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism 6 includes very little discussion specifically about Australia or advertising but does provide a sophisticated discussion of nationalism. Equally, Stuart Cunningham and Graham Turner's edited collection The Media in Australia, Industries, Texts, Audiences 7 provides a good general background to the television side of our investigation. Most significantly, we need to gather some information about theoretical perspectives. These perspectives provide a particular way of investigating and thinking about issues. Different theories lead researchers and thinkers to different approaches and to different understandings of what makes premises well-founded, relevant, and strong. In particular, theoretical perspectives establish the topic as a topic and set the parameters of investigation. Remember, there are many different ways of understanding the world, which are usually related to various academic disciplines. It was not, for example, until the 1970s that cultural studies, of the popular media, became common. Each theoretical perspective will have different ideas about what exactly is an appropriate topic for investigation and how we should go about it. In broad terms, then, we could think about whether our interest in the topic is, for example, psychological or sociological. We could also think about whether we are developing, for example, a feminist or Marxist critique of this research, reasoning, and analysis. 111 Use of nationalism. Judith Williamson's classic Decoding Advertisements, Ideology and Meaning in Advertisements 2, provides excellent theoretical material on critiques, rather than description, of advertising. In contrast, Mark Poster's The Mode of Information discusses the difficulties of even engaging in a critical analysis of television in the postmodern age. Neither book makes any reference to Australia or nationalist advertising, but both provide knowledge of the very ways in which we come to think about topics such as nationalist television advertising. 10 Although the most difficult class of knowledge to analyze and engage with, knowledge about the processes of developing or discovering knowledge, what philosophers call epistemological theory, is, in fact, the general key to effective reasoning in any particular situation. Information as it relates to how we are using it as well as classifying information in relation to the topic we are investigating. We can also think about 4 types of information in terms of how we will use that information in our own reasoning. This typology of information answers the question, how does this information relate to what I am trying to do in my argument or explanation? These 4 types do not coincide in any way with the 5 classes just discussed. We can find information of any type in any of the classes just discussed. All classes can contribute to the information of one type that we are gathering. The 4 main types of information are: 1. General understanding of the context in which we are preparing our reasoning, in effect, the context in which our text fits. 2. Opinions and conclusions from other people's arguments and explanations. 3. Basic details or evidence that we need as the main source of our premises for values and attitudes, of ourselves and others, that relate to our investigation. First of all, we need a general understanding of the context of our reasoning. It helps us to see the parameters of the topic or problem, the boundaries and overlaps between a particular topic and other related topics. Remember, all topics are, to some extent, artificial delineations within a swirling mass of ideas and events. Topics emerge through the ways that people think about this mass. We cannot impose whatever topics we want onto the world, but equally we cannot rely on the world to throw up topics ready-made. Similarly, general information helps us to see how any topic can be approached from different angles with different questions to be answered. In the nationalism example, you could, for example, ask, why do advertisers use nationalistic images and slogans? Or why do people respond well to nationalistic images and slogans? These questions address distinctly different issues, since it may be that people do not, on the whole, respond well to such images, but, for some reason, advertisers think they do. 112 Smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing. This sort of general information helps us think about where and how to search for more detailed information, and to settle upon an aspect of the topic on which to concentrate. For example, in a report to a marketing firm about what people see on television, the main focus would be on the former question, rather than the latter. The context of, for example, a short lecture to high school students would require that we keep the information in our argument or explanation consistent with their expectations and needs. If, on the other hand, we were writing a scholarly article about television advertising, then the different context would require more advanced and complex arguments. We need to gather background information in order to gain a good understanding of the context in which our reasoning takes place. Whatever we may think of a particular issue, we are also looking in our research for different opinions and conclusions. For any particular topic, a range of ideas will already have been expressed, and whatever we are doing needs to take account of them. Reasoning involves acknowledging what others have done and integrating our contribution, no matter how small, with the body of knowledge already assembled. We need to criticize conclusions that we oppose, ponder those that are interesting, and add to any with which we agree. In the advertising example, we find that some critics argue that nationalistic television commercials promote unhealthy competition and suspicion of foreigners. If we agree, then we should seek to substantiate this claim further. On the other hand, if, as part of our analysis, we are seeking to establish a different conclusion, we would not simply ignore this opposing view, but would seek information or give arguments that refute it. We need to consider these other conclusions in relation to what we are concluding in our own reasoning. Most of all, we need to base our reasoning on premises and further support for those premises. We might think of these premises as evidence or the facts, even though we must understand that most facts are only interpretations, claims that, depending on one's perspective, may become more or less doubtful. This information is usually what we produce through our own direct research, seeking to answer specific questions that we have established to guide our activities. As always, we need to be confident in the accuracy and acceptability of this information and be able to demonstrate it convincingly in our reasoning, for example, through appeals to authority. Referring back to our continuing example, we could use the following as evidence. Telecom spent over $1 billion on all advertising in 1994, and most of the commercials had a nationalist theme. Qantas consciously seeks to establish itself as a national Australian airline. Australians see themselves in the mold of Crocodile Dundee and other bush heroes. Yet we could also gather evidence to support any claims we make about the ways that intellectuals have previously written about advertising. For example, if our investigation includes a critique of marketing theorists' conclusions that television commercials are effective, we would need evidence, first of all, that these research, reasoning, and analysis 113 theorists had made such conclusions. When looking for evidence, then, we are not looking for a specific thing but simply the material that will become the majority of our premises. Finally, the sort of information that is most important, yet least often considered, is not actually stated in most books and articles. It remains implied, waiting within texts to be inferred by the readers. It concerns the values and attitudes of the authors of what you read and hear. These values include judgments about which actions are good and which are bad. For example, many commentators on nationalism believe that too much national pride is bad because it promotes conflict and competition. Unless we understand this value system, we cannot interpret and respond to what is written within it. We cannot understand the range of possible opinions on nationalism unless we understand that the same facts, say, one particular advertisement, may lead to dramatically different conclusions when interpreted from different political or ethical standpoints. Moreover, values can also relate to correct ways of investigating a problem. If we do a socio-economic analysis of television advertising in relation to the ways that large companies profit from calling upon consumers' patriotism, then, implicitly, we are making a value judgment that it is inappropriate to use a different approach, say, a psychological one that concentrates solely on how an individual responds to advertisements. Exercise 8.2 Think about an investigation in which you are currently engaged, an essay, report, experiment, whatever. Think of 2 examples for each of the 5 classes and 4 types of information listed above. Remember that for each type or class, it is a question of the relation between the knowledge or information and your topic. Reflect in particular on the context in which your investigation is occurring. Direct and indirect sources. Direct sources in broad terms, direct sources are those that provide first-hand information about events. A radio interview with a politician in which we hear what the politician has to say about the economy is first-hand. An extensive speech delivered in Parliament by the same politician is also first-hand. A book that analyses this politician's party true views about the economy is, by contrast, second-hand. In scientific disciplines, experiments are the most common direct source. In other disciplines, surveys and interviews, or research into written and oral records of events provide direct access to information. All these sources are direct and, within the appropriate context, recognized as containing original evidence and ideas. They are a significant source of the material we need to form our arguments and explanations. It used to be thought that these direct or primary sources were somehow more factual or descriptive, and that interpretation was added to them by one for smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing investigators when they wrote about their research. thereby creating a secondary or indirect source, see below. However, direct sources do contain values and elements of interpretation. 11 The importance of the distinction between direct and indirect sources, then, is not that one is fact and the other interpretation but, rather, one of context. For example, the comments made by an advertising agency director about nationalistic television commercials must be understood in relation to the person who made these comments, why, when, how, and in what situation the comments were made, and so on. If we do an experiment by measuring the biological reactions of people watching nationalist advertising under controlled conditions, then we, in effect, become the authors of that data, via the way that we establish the experiment. We would need to ask ourselves the same sorts of questions to understand the meaning of the data we gather. By doing so, we will recognize that the contexts in which this direct evidence of nationalist advertising is gathered is different to that in which we use it as part of our argument. In every case, then, direct sources can only be used effectively when we think about the context, as well as the content, of the information we draw from them. Sometimes, understanding this context involves asking questions about where and when the information was produced, by whom, for what purpose, on the basis of what knowledge, in relation to which issues. Equally, the context can be understood by thinking about our own engagement with the source. For example, scientists must check, when performing experiments, that they have established the experimental procedure properly, that there are no errors in their procedures, that they are reliable observers of the events, and so on. In each discipline, in each field of endeavor, there are basic rules that we must follow, and assumptions that we must make. When seeking to gather information from direct sources, there are also basic understandings about how to consider the context of the information. They are too numerous and complex to discuss here in detail, but two examples can be drawn from history and chemistry. In history, a standard approach is to think about the way in which a person's social position, class, race, gender, and so on, can influence and be seen in what they have said or written. In chemistry, experimental design is always used to control and maintain quality of experimental work. The information gained through an experiment is always assessed in the context of the way the experiment was performed. In general terms, we must learn the rules that are part of our context and consciously apply them so that we can use direct sources effectively. Indirect sources. As noted above, a direct source differs from an indirect source. Indirect sources involve the reports and analysis of direct information by other people. Reports, articles, and books by scholars are the main category of secondary sources that we tend to use, especially when we are beginning to develop our knowledge about an issue. Once again, the key to using such information is always to think about the research, reasoning, and analysis 115 context in which it was produced. In other words, information from indirect sources is only as good as our understanding of that source itself. For example, as a result of changes over the past 2 decades, an academic commentary such as the one by James on advertising in the 1970s may not be precisely relevant to contemporary concerns. There is no general rule to apply to such analysis of sources, except that we must always think about the context, who obtained the information, when, where, and how the information was arrived at, as well as the text, what the information is. For example, imagine you are watching a television program on advertising. The host makes some comments on nationalistic commercials, saying that they always produce an emotional reaction and that is why they are effective. Is this source useful for an academic investigation? If you answered no, then you would, in some circumstances, be correct. But the important question to ask is why? Let us contrast this hypothetical television program with a more usual source, academic writing. The trustworthiness of academic writing is based on the idea that the person doing the writing is an expert in that area, through their close study of the topic, their skills as a researcher, their careful, long-term analysis, and their involvement in a system in which articles and books are published only after the scrutiny of other qualified academics to determine if they are right or not. In other words, the claims are trustworthy because an institutionalized method makes them trustworthy. It is a social convention that academic work is regarded as being more sound, if often more remote, than popular work. It is also a worthwhile social convention because there are good reasons to accept this distinction in soundness. The usefulness of the television program depends, however, on what exactly we are trying to find. It might be quite relevant to argue that the popular perception of nationalist advertising is very important in the effectiveness of such commercials. So, even if we distrust many of the claims that are advanced in the popular media and trust those from more scholarly work instead, we can still use as evidence the fact that people do actually make and listen to the first sort of claim. In other words, while we may not trust the television program as an indirect commentary on advertising, we could certainly use it as a direct source of popular views on advertising. Did you see the difference? Sometimes we will want to make claims in our reasoning that convey information in the claims themselves. And sometimes we will want to make claims about the fact that a certain type of claim, or group of claims, has been made by others. Developing the latter type of writing is essential in good critical work and, thus, requires you to develop skills in knowing about sources of knowledge. Exercise 8.3 Write a short analysis of the different direct and indirect sources that you use most frequently in your current reasoning. What questions do you need to ask about them? What rules and assumptions, stemming from the discipline or 116 Smart Thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing profession in which you are working or studying, underlie the identification of these sources? 5 possible outcomes. Finding information effectively is, in large measure, a matter of understanding how that information or knowledge is to be used in your own arguments and explanations. Often we simply want some basic descriptive information to serve as claims in our reasoning without wanting to provide extensive supporting arguments. For instance, we read, in relation to our nationalistic advertisements investigation, that Crocodile Dundee was one of the most popular films ever screened in Australia. We can simply state this piece of information, either quoting exactly from the original or re-expressing the information in our own words, giving an appropriate reference to it. 12 We are simply taking a single claim from our source. We can also take an entire argument or explanation from our source. We could quote such reasoning exactly, but usually, for stylistic reasons, we express it in our own words. For example, James's article, mentioned above, argues that nationalistic advertisements encourage consumers to purchase a corporation's products because, by being Australian, even when the companies are often owned by foreign interests, the products are assumed to be better than others. We are, in effect, getting claims and links, reasoning, from the source. Can you see the trace of linking in because? Once again, we provide a reference in order to acknowledge our debt to the original author. Yet very often what we want to take from these sources is not that specific and cannot simply be found by looking at a certain page. Instead, we can summarize the basic argument or explanation in a source that we have read, always in our own words, reducing a long text to a short series of premises and a conclusion, which we can then use in our own argument, again, with an appropriate reference. For example, Anderson's Imagined Communities is a long and detailed work on nationalism that, in part, concludes that technologies that allow humans to overcome geographical distance, for example, railways, have played a significant role in the creation of modern nations. We could include such a summary, which, of course, can be expressed in the analytical format in our notes, within our own reasoning. We are, thus, taking from the source not a specific claim, nor a specific piece of reasoning, but our understanding, analytically speaking, of the source's overall argument or explanation. Fourth, we can take from sources a type of information that is far more indefinable than the information gained in any of the last 3 cases. This category can be summed up as positions and values. It is usually hidden within the source and can be recovered using your judgment, based on what you read or hear, of the underlying position that the author of the source holds. This underlying position can be inferred from that person's own arguments or explanations, or the way in which the arguments or explanations have been received by others. We read, for example, in Graham Turner's Making It National 15 that Australian businesses research, reasoning, and analysis 117 exploit national patriotism and sentiment to further their own profit-making goals. Whether we agree or disagree with this conclusion, whether we can refute it or not, we can nevertheless try to understand why he might have made such a conclusion. We can ask, what is the political and intellectual position that is implied by such claims? From the overall thrust of Turner's analysis, we judge that he is opposed to unfettered capitalism, seeking instead a greater degree of regulation in the national interest. In making this judgment, we can understand the assumptions that underlie the information in Turner's book, and the context in which it was written and presented to us. Without such analysis, you will always tend to respond to reasoning from your own point of view, without understanding why others might disagree with you. Whether or not you wish to change their minds or accept their right to be different is immaterial. Neither goal can be achieved if you do not know why they believe what they do. Finally, there are occasions on which we take nothing away from what we are reading or observing, except more questions. This outcome may be frustrating at times, but if we are seeking to be smart thinkers, we must be prepared to delve deeply into an issue and not rush too quickly to a satisfying answer. Remember, analysis continues through every stage of research, but smart thinkers are aware of this and draw encouragement from the way in which a book that tells you nothing might prompt the question, why does it not tell me anything? And, further, you can ask if the problem is with the book, with you, or perhaps with your original set of analytical questions. Exercise 8.4. Using a long piece of written work that you are reading at the moment, practice getting each of the 5 possible outcomes just discussed. Make sure that, in each case, you express your answers in the analytical structure format, except, of course, for the last category, for which you will simply have a list of further questions.